Welcome everyone to the last in the series of our MarshWatch programming. We've got the big wrap up coming, and hopefully, like this little mallard duckling, you're feeling bold and ready to take on some wetland bird ID on your own. Before we get started, I'd just like to say that I'm broadcasting from Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory, and it encompasses the homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Stoney, and Saulteaux First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. My name is Leanne Latrimoy, and I do absolutely love wetlands. That, you guys probably all figured that out by now. I say it often enough. But I also happen to work for Birds Canada. We're a not-for-profit organization with a mission to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And hopefully through some of the programming like this, we're going to hit most of those nails on the head, I hope. So hopefully you get a little bit of inspiration here to, get out, enjoy wetlands, and one of the best things I think for wetland conservation is just to talk to more people about how cool they are. It's amazing how those kind of little conversations can help turn someone's mind about, maybe I won't till over that wetland or push all the bush into it. If your neighbor says, "Holy man, like it is an amazing wetland you have there," and that's kind of what I like to do in terms of trying to help wetland conservation on my own. Okay, on the agenda for our last webinar, we're going to go over just a brief overview of why wetlands are important. We'll take a look at some of the plants that we've discussed in the series because we didn't have a chance to cover those last week. And then we're going to dive into some wetland soundscapes. I had a really great idea kind of at the 11th hour for these, so I made up 3 videos that hopefully we're going to go through some of these wetland soundscapes together. I would like to do more, but alas, I ran out of time. I'll cover again how to collect a checklist, and then I'm going to let you guys know about all of the dates for marsh walks. I've got some of the details. They're all posted online as well. Then we'll turn off the recording, and then we'll get into discussions. I don't have any quizzes for this webinar, but there is quizzes online. There's some of those kind of bigger recap quizzes, some of them a little bit harder than others, so you can check those out online if you haven't already. All right, let's get started. So what is a wetland? Well, the wetlands are really that kind of dynamic interface between a water system and a dry land system. They're really at the heart of that interface. They're not really a lake. The middle of a lake isn't considered a wetland, but the margins of it can be considered. If it's got these soils that are adapted to this wet environment and all these plants that are adapted to these, wet, mucky environments, those are wetlands. And they actually have a nice definition. It's land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity adapted to a wet environment. So it really is, an area of moist soils where the critters and plants that live in them are adapted to this kind of wet dry interface. And they are pretty dynamic, especially out here on the prairies, as we've seen that we can go through some pretty dry spells, and we often swing from the dry spells into a wetter cycle where the basins fill up again. And so it really is a really dynamic process. And a lot of that is, a natural process that happens and has been happening, for millennia. Um, Here's an example of a wetland that's kind of, you know, draining down a little bit. You can see some of these cattails are really, kind of sparse in here. It's not a very wet environment. It's not flooded with water, but something like this, as a season wears on, as it dries out from, all of that winter, precipitation input from snow, this will dry out as the season progresses. And, if you go through a few years of really dry conditions, that these wetland plants will eventually die out. Some more, drought tolerant plants will come in. But then as this area gets wet again, those dry loving plants are going to get flooded out, and the seed bank is going to refill in with all of those wetland plants that are adapted to those wet conditions. So they're really quite interesting little habitats. And out here on the prairies, we can actually classify these wetlands based on water permanence and vegetation zones. So there's some wetlands that are they're dry in 9 out of 10 years on average, or wetlands that only hold water ephemerally in the spring until the frost plug melts, and then they drain out. All of them are important for different suites of animals. There's actually a whole classification scheme that Stewart and Cantrud put together in 1971, and this was an attempt to really to help try to classify these different wetlands because they look different and they act a little bit different, and some of the species that they attract vary differently between the different classifications. Of course, you can also have multiple classes of a wetland, but when you're trying to determine the class of it, you're looking at the deepest part of the wetland. So here's just a schematic example of the different classes. And, you can just have a class one or a class two. Maybe there isn't, very permanent water, those ephemeral or temporary water basins that hold only, a little bit of water for a short amount of time in the spring, and the rest of the season they're dried up. So there's all kinds of different wetlands, everything from low prairie to, a big open water cattail wetland. And of course, especially out here on the prairies, we have a ton of wetlands. And if you remember, if you attended the very first webinar, we learn why on earth do we have all of these basins scattered across the landscape. It's really amazing. If you don't regularly scan the satellite view on Google Maps, I invite you to, you know, zoom out and take a look at the prairie landscape as a whole, because it is really quite fascinating, and it's a result of the last ice age. More specifically, it's a result of the meltdown from that ice age. As those ice sheets retreated, it wasn't kind of this nice, neat line of a great big ice sheet retreating, right? It wasn't this cliff of ice and it neatly eroded away. No, there was large lakes, there was bodies of water, there was rivers underneath those glaciers, and there was also these chunks of ice that got, left behind with all of that rubble and, you know, glacial till that got ground up. So some of these ice chunks would have, floated around or settled, and a bunch of precipitation, uh, not precipitation, a bunch of those glacial till, all of that, bits of rock and stuff that were ground up by those ice sheets would have formed around it, and that ice, as it slowly melted away, would have left a shallow depression, and this is how we get all of these little shallow depressions across the landscape. A lot of them are really just these little unconnected shallow basins, and the fact that they're unconnected is actually really helpful for most duck species, because if there's no, fish in those bodies of water, that means all of the little, phytoplankton and copepods and all of the little critters that make up, those wetland inhabiting insect species and crustaceans, those are all free for the ducks to eat and other critters to eat. So they're really, really productive little systems. But are they important? Well, we've hinted at this before in a variety of ways. Wetlands really act as a sponge. If you've ever gone into a wetland and walked around, it's pretty mucky, right? It's not a hard bottom. It's usually very, very soft. Probably smell some gases that are coming up from it. And if you've ever grabbed a handful of that, you'll notice that it's mostly organic material. There's a little bit of, mineral material for sure, but an awful lot of that is going to be, old decomposing plant matter. And this plant matter really does act as a sponge. So when, you know, the wetland is full of water, you can imagine it as a sponge just sitting there in a tub of water. But if that water drains, as it often does throughout the season, that sponge, you can imagine if you're holding it out of the water, still contains a lot of water because it's very, very porous. And it's the same with the wetland soil. So they hang on to a lot of water, and they'll slowly let that water go, say, as, maybe the wetland is receding, or it's drying up over the summertime. It really is going to act as a sponge, so it helps to sequester carbon. They recharge the groundwater that way. They're also really good at absorbing floodwater, so when a lot of water comes through, these soils, they swell, and they help trap some of that water and slow down its flow, slowing down the destructive nature of it. So they're really quite incredible at doing that sort of thing. They also help to purify the water. They prevent shoreline erosion, especially when you get wetlands, along a big basin of water that's prone to some wind and wave action. Those wetlands really do help to maintain that nice shoreline. And of course, they provide food and essential habitat for a variety of animals, everything from fish, shellfish, water birds, land birds, mammals, critters that live in the wetlands year round, some that only stop over for maybe even just a really brief amount of time, to ones that, make their way north in the springtime, breed here, and head further south. They're really essential habitat for a wide variety of animals. And of course, they're also food and resources for humans. Humans mine peat in some places, and that's, helpful for amending soil. We can harvest wild rice, cranberries, and of course, they're nurseries for fish, game, and plant roots. So they're really incredible places that are really important on the landscape. And like I said, whenever, I'm talking to someone who owns a piece of property, because I do genuinely love wetland. It's if, say I had to drive past a wetland on their driveway to get to the farmhouse, I usually try to tell people just how excited I am that they have a wetland and anything that I would have seen on it coming in, because I don't think a lot of people always value wetlands for, the services that they provide for, all of those critters and all of those other benefits that I mentioned. So that's what I like to do as my little, wetlands are important, wetlands are cool, and they're really neat. So I suggest that you try to do that if you think wetlands are awesome. Talk to people about them. Try to, take someone out to birdwatch at them. They're pretty neat places to go see. Here's just some cute examples. That mallard duckling chasing a midge, and something as big as a Franklin's gull, is also going to be flying around and catching those midges. And, sometimes those hatches of insects that we go, gosh, like what is the point of all of these? They're actually really critically important little food sources. Okay, now about enough of the why wetlands are important spiel. Let's move on to some of the common wetland plants. And again, as we talked about at the very beginning of this, these plants are really going to be adapted to wet environments, and some of them are more tolerant to flooding for varying degrees. Some of them really like to have their feet wet and really thrive when they're in that kind of deeper water setting, and some of them really are specialists of the edge, really just more of a moist soil species. So it's really, you do have specific vegetation for a lot of the different water depths and soil types. Okay, first we'll talk about the cattails. These are kind of those forbidden corn dog looking things, when they've grown their flowers and their seed heads, especially, you can see these nice little brown corn dogs that pop up on that little stick there. The leaves are bright green, they're flattened, they have many leaves that grow from a central base, and they can be quite tall. They can range from 5 to 10 feet tall. Sometimes they're a little bit stunted in areas where they don't have very much water, and say they're either just getting a toehold in, or, the conditions are degrading for them, as like, oh, if it's getting drier and drier, you'll wind up having shorter and shorter cattails because they just don't have exactly what they need to thrive. So the flowers, like I said, those corn dogs on a stick, and you may see, especially this time of year, the previous season's flowers, they're all going to be very fluffy, and this can be a food source for animals. This little wren is likely going to grab some of this and line his nest with it. So, you know, they make little fluffy cattails. They're very, very cute. I quite enjoy them. And you can find them in deep or shallow waters. They can form floating mats, which are kind of terrifying to walk on if you haven't had the pleasure of doing so. And they often form these large kind of monoculture stands. So you often have just a big area where it's mostly just cattail in the wetland. Another species that we're going to find in the deeper water wetland, we got these bulrushes. They've moved them recently to the Chenoplectus genus. That's always a bit of a tongue twister. So these are often quite large. They're about 3 to 10 feet tall. They have a dark green, very round stem with a spongy center. If you ever see some and there's a whole bunch of them, try breaking a piece off and you'll see all of these little, vacuoles in them. Then they're really quite spongy, that way. They're quite pretty. So they make this single spiked stalk, and the flowers are kind of tassels near the tip of the leaf. They like deep water marshes as well, and they too form large monoculture stands. And it's interesting, you can see in areas where you have both cattails and bulrushes at a distance, the bulrushes always appear this very, very dark, deep green, whereas the cattails usually, form this kind of lighter green mass. We talked about the common reed as well. This is also known as Phragmites. There is a native Phragmites and there is an invasive Phragmites. They're different subspecies of the same species. So in general, though, They're very grassy looking, and they are indeed a grass. So they have bright green leaves when they're fresh. They can grow extremely tall, up to 20 feet. I've been in some where it's literally like you're walking through a forest. They sort of resemble bamboo in that they have a hollow stem and little joints along the stem. And the flowers, the seed heads, make this kind of feathery, seed head at the very, very top. It's very characteristic. You'll find them in wetlands, of course, but they often also colonize ditches. They're actually quite salt tolerant, and they do form large monoculture stands. The European subspecies is quite invasive. The native one, you don't see a ton of it around for the most part, but the European one, for whatever reason, is extremely aggressive and will get into areas and choke out all the other vegetation. There's less species that use, Phragmites than would use the species that they're displacing. And it is kind of difficult to tell the two apart. The invasive species, the stem stays greener longer into the fall. The native one turns this bright red in the fall. So that's probably the easiest kind of big scale thing to look at for these. The other features are really difficult to take a look at unless, you have a hand lens and you are familiar with botany. So I would just go with, if you see it in the fall and it has these dark red stems, you're dealing with the native species. So I know the question came up, in one of the webinars. I have this, I'm not sure which one it is. My suggestion, if you don't have, a hand lens or familiar with grass botany, wait until the fall and see what color the stems turn, because the native species does turn a nice darker shade of red, whereas the invasive one is going to stay green throughout much of the fall and winter. Okay. We also have little duckweeds. These guys are tiny floating plants of the Lemna genus. They have 2 to 3 leaves. They're floating. They can form dense, thick mats. They're actually quite nutritious. There's a lot of duck species that do eat a lot of duckweed. They have itty bitty, teeny tiny flowers that are not visible, and they'll form these kind of great big mats in still water. So it's not going to be, flowing, but if you have some deeper water, take a look in with those cattails. You might have a layer of duckweed there. On small ponds too, they can actually form quite a dense mat. There is another subspecies here, which is a kind of sort of a 3-leafed one. It's also very cute. It looks a little bit different than the classic Lemna here. Okay, we also have Carex sedges, and these are very grass-like plants. They have firm ridges in their leaves. The memory aid for them usually goes, sedges have edges. So if you feel the leaves, they're really going to be this kind of um, jagged like W in cross section. If you were to like slice the leaf and look at it on end, you would see these kind of ridges that are relatively firm, they're almost rough feeling. They have triangular stems and they grow about 1 to 3 feet. The flowers form these cute little spikelets, kind of have this little inflated balloon type looking thing on most of them, and that contains the little flower and the nutlet as the nutlet grows. You'll find these in shallower waters, so on the edges of wetlands or in wet meadow type areas. These are going to be forming a fairly dense mat in a lot of those more shallow um, those little, shallow water wetlands. You're going to find things like Nelson sparrow, LeConte sparrow, bobolinks in places where you have these sedges, yellow rails like sedge wetlands as well. So it's a shallow wetland species. There's also rushes. These are really wiry little things. They resemble the bulrush that we were talking about earlier, but they're really, really dark green. They're not very tall. They're, pretty short, up to 2 feet in length, and they really have this kind of wiry feel to them. They're round in cross section, and I've heard, ranchers refer to it as round grass before, or wire grass, and they really are quite firm and wiry. They do make these beautiful little flowers, either kind of halfway up the stem or near the tip. And you'll find these in moist soil areas, so kind of those ephemeral wetlands. So if you're ever out on a pasture where you haven't had these shallow wetlands tilled up, you'll often see rushes, and they too are very dark, much like the bulrushes. Very, very dark, circular. It's not quite grass-like, but it's more just a very long spear, very pointy at the very tip of it. So I kind of like rushes myself. They're always making this nice dark matte in some otherwise kind of pale grass. So I think rushes are pretty cute little plants. Spike rushes are one that you'll find a bit more, in a shallow water to wet meadow. They're similar to that kind of rush that we were talking about, except they have the flowers right at the very end. So the long spike of green ends in a little point of, little flowers. It really does look like a spear. So these are called spike rushes. They're often round in cross section, single spiked stalk. They can be up to 3 feet, and they do look a bit shorter than that, but they can grow in a little bit of water. So oftentimes half of the plant is submerged. So very nice little spike rush plant here. We also have some invasive species that you should keep an eye out for. There's flowering rush. This is a plant that has pink flowers in an umbel, which is sort of like if you think about an umbrella, you have the central point here and you have these spokes with all of these little flowers at the ends of them. So that's a good way to think about an umbel. They have long pointed leaves and they can be up to 1 meter long. They're also triangular in cross section. If they're flowering, they're actually really, really beautiful plants. And the first few times that I saw this plant, I didn't know it was an invasive species. It was only in talking with a friend who was working for the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center. She says, "What? You saw that?" Anyway, so keep an eye out for this plant. There's only a few places on the prairies where it does occur, but it is moving along the South Saskatchewan River from Alberta into Saskatchewan. So if you do see it, keep an eye out for it. And a good place to put an observation of something like this would be in iNaturalist, because the conservation data centers usually do pay attention to that, and you can add it directly to their invasive species program. So you'll find this in slow moving or kind of still water up to 3 meters deep. And of course, purple loosestrife has bright purple flowers in spikes, common in wetlands. It is an invasive species. Don't see it quite as much out here on the prairies as you do back east, but it's another one of those species that, isn't native to the region, doesn't have all of the normal checks and balances that, the species that are native to North America, have to keep them in check and not running rampant. They can really take over a wetland. And while they are very pretty, they do choke out other native species that plants rely on and that our native pollinators, rely on as well. So they have square stems with paired leaves. They're in the mint family. And they're often found in ditches, wet meadows, marshes, and lake edges. And here's just a close-up of that stem, square and having, kind of those leaves in clasping pairs around them. If you want to submit your plant photos, you can do that to iNaturalist. That's probably the best place for a lot of these, especially if you're finding any of those invasive species. It'd be really great to report those there. If you haven't used iNaturalist, it's much like a lot of apps where you just record your observation, share it, and then other people will corroborate your identification, and then something can be classified research grade. So it's a really useful little thing. It's also quite fun to do if you like to take photos. This is where I put all of my, plant photos, insect photos, anything essentially that's not birds goes for me into iNaturalist. So I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. Phew. Okay. As I was mentioning, wetland plants at a distance, you can see that there's some cattails here on the left. Last year's stems are going to be kind of this pale straw color. There'll also be that same color in the rushes as well. So here you can see it's kind of springtime where there's a fairly decent mix of the older stems and the newer stems. All those dark areas in the back, those are all bulrushes. That really dark green and those kind of long circular spikes coming out of the grass, or coming out of the water. And in the foreground here, we have some shorter sedges. They're kind of grassy like. So those are some of those wetland plants at a distance. Okay, now, next, I'm actually pretty excited about this, and I hope that it works out as planned. So I hope that everybody is going to be able to hear these. I have boosted the sound on them, so hopefully it plays through, because for whatever reason, whenever you import something into PowerPoint, it just dampens the audio, and I'm not sure why, so I've had to boost the audio quality in a bunch of these, and I think they're going to be loud enough, and I've got them set to max. So, turn your volumes up for this one. It's going to be worth it. So what we're going to do is I've got 3 soundscapes, and they're going to be increasing in length and complexity. So this first one is from near Foam Lake, and they're all going to be from this study area where we had a bunch of bioacoustic recorders making recordings day and night throughout a bunch of wetland systems near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan. So this is a recording from June 3rd at 1 a.m. And I'm just going to play it for you now. I don't have any annotations at the moment on it, so it's just going to play, and I want you to just kind of maybe close your eyes if it helps you. If it doesn't help you, keep them open, but I want you to try and listen and see if you can pick out any of the species. I'm going to play this one twice because it is relatively short, and in the next video we'll go through it a few times because I've made some animations and little pictures of the birds are going to pop up when the bird is singing. So hopefully this works. Hopefully you enjoy it. And, I'm going to look forward to some feedback on this because I think it's fun, but you never know how something is going to play out. So I haven't done this before, and I'm hoping that you guys will enjoy it. So let's take a listen. This is a clip that's about 24 seconds long, so I'm just going to let it play and just try to listen and see if you can't, tell different sounds apart. If you remember what some of the birds sound like, that's great, but you can also practice just trying to listen and tell if it sounds like there's, different bird species singing. Okay, I'll stop talking. I'll get to playing it. Okay. I hope everybody got a good listen to that one. I'm going to play it again just so that you can really immerse yourself in the soundscape of it all. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And in this one, I'm not going to do any talking, but I'm going to let the little birds pop up. And so I hope maybe you could recognize maybe some of those calls, or if you couldn't recognize the calls, that's okay. Hopefully you were able to tell that there was, a few different species calling. Usually for most species, there was only one individual. In the loudest one, there was actually 2 individuals. So play it again for you now. And this time, little images of birds will pop up with their names. Seeing comments that the Virginia rail sounds like a guinea pig. It is. It does sound like a little piglet noise sort of thing. And hopefully you could tell that if you don't have the sound up loud enough, I'll invite you to, take a look at the recording once I post it online and try to really boost the audio. But there was a Virginia rail going. It was kind of far away and quiet. And then the second one that was closer to the recording device went off. And I like those little interaction moments because you can hear the one do a grunt and then the other one chime in like, aha, yes, I too am here. Let's play that again with those little birds coming on. So hopefully you're able to pick out that sedge wren We talked about that one having a couple of intro notes and then that kind of staccato, rattle or trill at the end that really sounds dry, mechanical, very much like a sewing machine. That LeConte sparrow singing a few times in the background um, kind of does like a and then you can hear the pie-bill grebe as well going. It's not the clearest, it's a little bit far. And especially I find pie-bill grebes, they don't always do kind of their classic full song, and sometimes they can just draw out some really strange parts of the song. So I'll play it again and hopefully you guys won't get too bored. Yeah, there's a few I in all of these I've left out the really quiet ones because I wasn't sure how well they were going to come through. So absolutely there's often a little bit, more going on than I've highlighted just because there is some stuff in the background that's like, I just really want to highlight the stuff that most people will hear. But if you tune your ear in, hopefully you can, try to pick out if there's anything that I missed or anything that I didn't highlight. But let's play it one more time. Okay. Well, I'm seeing that people are enjoying this, so I'm glad. I had a lot of fun making these, but the idea only came to me, 2 days ago. So I'm gonna try to do a few more of these, and I've already got more ideas to work this sort of thing into, the overall material for next year. And this is like anything. The more you do it, the more you get better at doing it, and the more you come up with better ideas for it. So I'm excited already for next year's. Okay. Soundscape number 2. This is, of course, also by Foam Lake. This time, immerse yourself in the moment. It's June 25th, 2015 at 4 a.m. in the morning. So let's listen to this, go over it a couple times without any of those little clues for you, and then we'll listen to it a few times with the clues. Okay. This is getting me really excited for some of the marsh walks, I have to say. Okay, go on to taking a look at the audio with the clues. Hopefully you have some ideas for some of the species that are calling. If it all sounds like just bird chatter to you, that's totally fine. We'll go through it one time here with the clues. And if you're really astute and you know a few more bird calls, there's a few that I didn't list because they aren't necessarily wetland species, but there's also a savanna sparrow calling as well as a clay-colored sparrow. Clay-colored sparrow just kind of does a repeated buzz, and the savanna sparrow kind of does a bit more of a that's terrible. Say Savannah is another mnemonic for it, but really terrible. It's only audible in the background, but we'll play that again. So hopefully you guys are catching some of those species. Sometimes it's helpful if you try to just pick one and try to listen for it through the rest of the noise, because this is really what we do when we're doing a point count, when we're getting out there counting birds, is that, you're taking it all in, you're writing down, the things that are kind of going constantly that are really common. So, I'd be noting down all of this. I could be like, okay, we got sedge-wrens, red-winged blackbirds, Wilson snipe, and then you just kind of start to not ignore, but start to hear through that other kind of chatter and try to pick up things that are different from that chatter, if that makes a little bit of sense. So it's some of it is definitely, an art to listening through a bit of noise to listen specifically for something. So I'm going to invite you to, pick one of those species and try to focus on it, throughout this recording. Maybe it's the Wilson snipe. That kind of sounds a bit lower and it just goes. So maybe try to pick something like that, or try to really clue into that sedge wren every time that sedge wren goes. Or, maybe you want to really try to listen hard for red-winged blackbird. If you've got good bass on your headphones, you might also notice that there's a very distant American bittern that calls at the start there. So I'll play it again and try to, listen for one of those species. Maybe try to listen for the common yellowthroat or something. Just try to pick one and try to, focus on it as the track is playing. It is tough, and I'm seeing somebody mention it's kind of like showing at a convention where there's lots of languages going on, and it's like the same sort of thing, If all of those languages are foreign to you, you're not really going to be picking up anything, but maybe there's a glimmer of a language that you do speak. Let's use English because that's what we're using here. So let's say you're at a French conference and you really don't speak any French, but you'll be able to pick up that one person over on the other side that's saying a few words of English because your ear is a bit more attuned to it. And it's the same with birds. And it is practice, and it is getting out there and just trying to, learn a few really well and pick up on those. Play it one last time, and then we'll move on to our busier last one. Okay, so hopefully some of you guys are starting to pick up on a few of those species, because our last one is going to be, pretty busy. I haven't gone through and tagged, numbers of how many individuals there are of a given species. I really just want you to focus on, the specific sounds that species is making. But, maybe if you're a little bit more advanced, maybe you can try to count the soras in the recording, because there is going to be quite a few in this one coming up. Okay. Listen to it going blind. Apparently, if I try to type in the chat, it stops the video. I see there was a question, what time of day? This one was at 4 a.m. So if you really, get into birds, they do quite enjoy the early morning hours. But wetlands are interesting because, a lot of wetland species are also very vocal at night and in the evening, so it doesn't always have to be first thing in the morning. But that was a rather busy 4 a.m. call, or soundscape rather. So this was May 25th, pretty early in the season. Birds are just getting on territory and they're really, really going for it. And this recording was actually made probably very close by where this picture was taken. So it's quite a deep water area, and it's just vast. It goes on for miles, quite literally, of wetland. So I'll play the one here um, with the little images coming up, and I'm seeing, yes, absolutely, Sora City. This whole wetland complex, we actually went out in 2015 to trap some soras because we had a graduate student come up from the States, and, she was looking at feather isotopes, and it was easy to catch soras because this place was just littered with them. Like, yeah, it was amazing, the density of soras out here. So I haven't, like I said, I haven't quantified the number on any of these, and you'll just see that Sora is going to be on the screen for most of it, as is marsh wren. There's marsh wrens essentially going almost the entire track, so those guys are up fairly consistently as well. So let's take a listen with those little bird prompts. So as you could tell, that was quite the marsh wren party and the Sora party. I think in that track there's probably 4 or 5 Soras going at different distances away. When we make recordings like this, we listen to them with, really good stereo headphones, and we're also bringing up the spectrogram. You would have seen that, I think, last week. I think I showed some of the amphibian spectrograms just to show you an idea of a little bit of the pitch, and that actually paints a picture. So as we're listening to tracks like this, we can see the different bird calls over time on it, and that also helps us to do a bit of a count if you're sitting there at your desk with some headphones on doing bird counts that way. Because the passive recorder is great, you can stick it in the wetland and you don't have to send somebody out at 1 a.m. to go survey it, though I personally was the strange one who really liked the nighttime surveys. I think I was mostly alone in that sentiment. I don't think the rest of my field colleagues enjoyed it. So I'll play it once more again with those bird prompts coming up, and hopefully you're able to pick out most of them. The yellow-headed blackbirds, they're really kind of in the background. They're not the loudest and most prominent bird. You can hear the redwings go quite a few times, but definitely hear soras going on and on and on. And you can hear them, one of them will start going and that'll spur another one to start going and that'll spur a third one to start going because they're really just very, very vocal and territorial. So it's always fun when you have an area that has a lot of soras. It can be quite noisy. So I'll play that again for you here. Phew, that is quite the busy site. So I hope you guys were able to pick out, some of the different bird calls in, within that vocal fray. It really is quite, the cacophony of sounds, especially if you get a busy wetland first thing in the morning. The marsh wren really is going pretty much the whole time. It's also making very subtle kind of little noises here and there as it's kind of, probably bouncing around, going about its business. Wrens really do call very, very regularly when they're calling. So if you do, have an area with marsh wrens or sedge wrens, they're going to give you ample time to practice their songs and calls because they're really, really very, very vocal. I see a question here. Amira is wondering why feather isotopes would be what they are and why they would be important. So isotopes are different configurations of elements. I think it has to do with the neutrons. Oh goodness, my my basic chemistry is a long way off. Long story short, though, everywhere in the world has different concentrations of these different isotopes, and when a bird is growing their feathers, those elements get incorporated into their feathers, and that's going to be pretty specific to location. It's not, exact pin on a map, but it's going to be a broad general area. So you'd be able to tell, say, if you were catching these sora, where they were spending their winter, if on the wintering ground, that's where they replace their feathers. So it requires that a little bit about bird molts. So when they're going to be, molting their feathers. Sometimes birds molt a bunch of them at the same time or in a really short period of time, but more often than not, they'll molt some of them, not all of them. So it really depends on the species and what it is you're looking for. So long story short, it can be a chemical way to get an idea for where the bird was when it was changing out its feathers, and that can be useful in biology. So if you want to take, yes, to the number of neutrons, yes, I'm not totally off base. Some of this stuff is a little while ago, and I'm not an isotope specialist, so that's why it can be useful though. So the person that we had here was, running an isotope analysis on some sora feathers, as well as Virginia rails and yellow rails. So as you can see, this was a very fruitful area given the number of soras and Virginia rails. I really wish that I had thought of coming up with these videos beforehand, because I would love to just do a whole evening of that. And that's likely something that I'm going to try working into the webinar series next year, because I think this is going to be a helpful tool. I'll try to work them in kind of as we go in the series, so that it's not, we're only doing it at the very end. So I'm seeing that I think some people are interested in this, and as we'll talk about in a bit here, you'll have a chance for feedback to let me know, yes, more of this, or nah, I didn't think it was very useful. So hopefully you found it useful. I found it fun to make. Okay, if you do want to get out there and collect a MarshWatch checklist that's going to be, amphibians calling and birds that you're hearing, you can get out at any wetland you like, anywhere in North America. It doesn't need to be Canadian only. I think last year I had a few coming in from the States as well. So if you want to, you can go out and collect a MarshWatch checklist. It is one of the ways that we track engagement, and we're, applying for funding. We say, oh, we're aiming to get, 50 checklists or 100 checklists. People really want to know that, the work that we're doing is translating into people, getting out there. We also obviously use attendance at, the webinars themselves and the walks, but all that to say is that checklists, they do help. I do get asked on occasion for this type of data, so it is useful to do. You can't log amphibians with eBird, so this is my little plug for why doing a MarshWatch checklist. I'm going to talk with our database folks, because we do have a way that we can automatically push these checklists to eBird, or vice versa, bring some of them in from eBird. So I'm going to talk to them about enabling that feature on the MarshWatch protocol, because you can do it for the Breeding Bird Atlas. So why not for the MarshWatch? Anyway, if you want to get the app or use a data sheet, you're welcome to do that. The data sheet is available on the MarshWatch website. On the backside, it also has some handy reference material, so maybe you just want to download and print it, just because it might be useful to you. And then get out, observe any wetland that you like. You can go collect 50 checklists from the same wetland if you like, or, just one from a wetland that you love. Identify and count the birds and note the amphibians, and, observe what you're able to. If you only know a few species, say it's an incomplete checklist, or if you feel like you've got your marsh species down and you're able to report on what was there, go ahead and call that a complete checklist. Either way, they're going to be useful information, so you can submit it through the app. Or if you're like me and you tend to prefer pen and paper, you can then go through and submit it on the Nature Counts website. The way to submit observations, you'll find it on the MarshWatch webpage. There's a button there that says Submit Observations, and you'll be taken to Birds Canada's Nature Counts platform. And speaking of, how did we do this season of MarshWatch? I was blown away, because we're almost at 300 registrations, 296. I was kind of floored when, you know, I would check on it every once in a while. It's like, holy smokes, there's 200 people registered. It kind of blindsided me. On average, we've had 126 people attend the webinars, which is amazing. That's triple what we had last year. And at least 206 unique viewers tuned in to varying degrees. Not everybody's able to make all the webinars, which is why we have the recordings. And those have garnered so far 179 hours of watch time. I'm surprised. So it's amazing that people are, going on and either, catching up on the material or reviewing it. Either way, I'm also kind of flabbergasted at how many hours we've received for views. We had 4 checklists submitted so far, so I'm pretty excited about that. We're hoping to get to 100, so if you can all take one checklist, I'll be able to really check that box off for some of the funding reports. But I'm not trying to pressure you. Submit submit a checklist or don't. I don't want any of this series to be pressured. So do what you will. The marsh walks. So this is going to be the next phase, because we're not going to be meeting on Wednesdays anymore unless you tune in next year when I run the program again. If you do want to come hang out in person, I'm going to be at the following locations on the following dates. Regina, I'll be there pretty soon, Sunday, June 9th. Saskatoon, Saturday, June 15th. Prince Albert, Sunday, June 16th. Brandon, Saturday, June 22nd. Winnipeg, Sunday, June 23rd. And Blaine Lake, which is north of Saskatoon and kind of southwest of Prince Albert. I'll be there on Sunday, July 7th. There's going to be details on the MarshWatch page, so go ahead and check that out. I'm going to run through very quickly some of the details here. In Regina, we're going to meet at the McKell-Wascana Conservation Park. You can park along Wascana Crescent. We'll meet at the concrete pad, and we'll be taking a walk. We'll probably just kind of do a bit of meandering. So if you want to meet us there at 9 or find us on the trail, we're not going to be hard to spot. We'll be the group of people. There's going to be at least 3 of us for sure, myself, Kyle, and local expert Dan Sawatsky. So 3 of us will be there. We're going to have some scopes. Like I said, not going to be very hard to find. We'll probably walk across here, spend a fair bit of time, and looks like there's a few little boardwalks and a few other lookout points. So come say hi, have a look in Regina. In Saskatoon, we're going to be meeting at Hyde Park. We're going to do a counterclockwise loop, exiting right there from the parking lot. We can do this nice big loop. There's usually pie-billed grebes. We had canvas back there last year, bufflehead. So it was a nice little walk. There's also some ruddy ducks hanging out over here. So we'll do the loop around Hyde Park, and then we'll go check out Trounce Pond. So feel free to meet us on the trail. We're also going to be fairly easy to spot. It's not a terribly big park, and the vegetation is not very tall, so we are going to be quite visible. In Prince Albert, we're going to be going near Spruce Home, and we'll be meeting at the farm of one of the MarshWatch participants, and then we'll get into some vehicles and hopefully do a bit of carpooling, and we will convoy around. We'll go visit Cheel Lake and Taylor Lake, where we will do a little bit of walking, but also some opportunistic, you're driving, you see a cool wetland, and it's a quiet grid road, we'll pull off and we'll take a look at some of those wetlands. So just to give you an idea of some of the places we'll be visiting, Cheel Lake is this nice big blob over here, and then we'll go visit Taylor Lake. There's a nice road that runs along through it that's not really much of a road anymore, and so we'll just take a walk, and it will be, hopefully very nice, and we'll get some good looks at some ducks. Again, I'm always going to be bringing a spotting scope and extra binoculars with me, so feel free to come. It's about a 15-minute drive north of Prince Albert, so it's still pretty close. So this one you need to register for, because I'm not going to give that dear lady's address out to the world. So when you go for more information on the webinar, there is going to be a link to a Google form, and just make sure you fill out your email address, and then I will send out an email telling you where to go. We're also going to be in Brandon Saturday, June 22nd. We're going to go and visit the Riverbank Discovery Center. We'll start that walk at 8 a.m. But again, feel free to catch us on the trail. We're going to wander around this kind of lovely wetlandy area, and then if time permitting and people are still interested, we'll probably check out a few of the other wetlands as well, but we should be fairly easy to find if 8 a.m. is not your cup of tea and you want to come by a little bit later. Though maybe with those 4 a.m. Marsh tracks, you guys will be pretty excited to check out the wetlands early in the morning. Winnipeg. So we are indeed going to go to Fort White Alive. We do have room in the budget, so we're going to be covering the entry cost for anybody that wants to attend. We've capped it at 13 people because there's going to be 2 of us leading the walk, mostly because I don't want it to be very, very big groups on some of those kind of relatively narrow boardwalks, and also our budget is modest, so that you need to register for as well. And we'll meet at the front of the interpretive center at 9. Once I know how many people are indeed showing up, we'll go settle up at the front, and then we will wander around. They've got really cool boardwalks through various wetland habitats and ponds, so I'm actually really excited to check this place out. I've heard lots of good things. Anybody I asked for, what's a good wetland place in Winnipeg, in the city of Winnipeg, really came out Fort White Alive, and so I reached out to them, and they're going to give us a group rate. So do come out, and again, if you want to bring your spouse, bring kid, bring a friend, all of these they're open to anyone to attend, but we are capping this one at 13 people just because of logistics. And last but not least, we're going to meet at Blaine Lake on Sunday, July 7th. We'll meet at 9 a.m. At Betty's Diner / Gas Plus. It's right next to Gillies Lake. So we'll take a drive out, and we'll take a look, scope out this area of the wetland. Then we'll cruise around and we'll take a look at some Fish and Wildlife Development Fund land, and hopefully I'm gonna try to get permission for a little bit more wetland area north of there, but I haven't been able to make the phone calls yet. So if you do want to come out to that, it's about 50 minutes north of Saskatoon, or about an hour southwest of Prince Albert. If anybody's coming from Saskatoon, I'm going to have 2 or 3 spots in my vehicle. So if you want to come out for that, get in touch. I'm happy to carpool. It's always, nicer to drive with friends than by yourself. So if you're open to that sort of thing, feel free to come join us at Blaine Lake. It should be a nice time. I have seen piles of snow and Ross's geese here in the fall, so I'm really excited to see it in the springtime. Phew. Okay, those are the marsh walks. I'm going to send out a feedback survey. I haven't had a chance to put it together yet, but when I get back from my field stint this week, I'll pull it together. I'll probably send it out kind of mid next week. Did this last year as well, and it's really helpful for me to know, how did you hear about the programming? What did you think of it? Was it too long, too short? I'm gonna, I'll have questions about it, and there's also opportunities for kind of testimonials, and I like to solicit these because, oftentimes people put in the chat that, really, really nice things, and I'm not always good at capturing that, but it's the sort of thing that really appeals to anybody who's looking to fund this sort of programming. If I can put in, that some folks thought it was pretty great, you can do that anonymously as well, or you can, leave your name. It is just helpful for, reporting back to funders and applying for funding the next year if we can say, look, this is pretty cool programming and people like it. So take a look out for that email. I'm going to send it to everybody who registered, and even if someone only attended once or didn't attend at all, I still want to hear about what they thought of the programming. So keep an eye out for the feedback survey, and I will also send an email out to everyone next week that also probably going to have it go out in the same email that just has, direct links to all of those little bits of information for the field weeks, because I won't get to harass you every week and tell you to come for a walk with me. Phew. So thank you guys so much for your attention. The 10 weeks has flown by. I don't know about you, but it kind of seems like we just started this thing. So I'm excited. It's not possible to do without you guys. So, a big thank you to you. MarshWatch, this is a program that myself and Kyle Drake here in Saskatoon that, we developed. It'd been kind of brewing for a couple of years, and eventually we just decided to go with it, get a little bit of seed funding. We also had input on the material from our great marshy colleagues across Canada. We got Doug Tozer, Amy Lee Cohenberg, Andrew Coughlin, and David Bradley, who helped give input. I am hoping that someday some of my colleagues won't be quite so swamped and we can roll this out to other places. But if you've ever worked for a not-for-profit, you know that there are a lot of hats that you wind up wearing, and you don't always have time to do everything you want. But hopefully, we can get MarshWatch rolling in other places as well. So with that, again, a big thank you. Here's my contact information. You can reach out to Birds Canada, of course. And I'd just like to thank the supporters who, provided the funding to make this and our upcoming marsh walks possible. We've got the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Birds Canada is a not-for-profit, so if you are able and you feel moved to make a donation, I'd encourage you to do so. It's the kind of thing that, to use that PBS line, it's your donation is what makes this possible. It really is. Not-for-profits rely a lot on granting sources, but those can be quite sometimes ephemeral. So if you're able to, I encourage you to do that. I would be very grateful. So thank you guys so much. I am going to end it here, the recording anyway, and I will see you guys next time.